After flight clearance was granted by the local Air Force, Nomad touched down in El Dorado. Sunny pressed the button to lower the hatch. The thinness of the outside air startled her. The air was thin. El Dorado International Airport was over 8,000 feet above sea level, an elevation high enough for air pressure to significantly affect the boiling point of water. I wondered if that would affect the taste of her eggs. Could it possibly be for the worse? You might have inferred this already because air traffic control was being performed by the military, but the El Dorado Airport was jointly a civilian and military airport. The Air Force was in full presence, with old C-130s scattered everywhere. America had probably sold them off decades ago. "I think those are PMC transport craft," Campbell said from the screen. Emblazoned on the side of the planes was Pierre Armament's ominous logo, 8 tentacles poking out of the eyes, nose, and mouth of a skull, Pierre being French for octopus. I've heard that people in southern France sometimes eat octopus, but whoever designed that fearsome image couldn't have been a fan of the dish. As Snake performed one last inspection of his gear, Campbell decided to use the time to introduce Snake to his psychological counselor for the mission. He called her over next to the desk to get her on the video feed. She was young and attractive, with straight black hair. "This is Rosemary," he said. Snake and I looked at each other at the same time, but not just in reaction to her beauty. This young woman had been Jack's lover, and during the Big Shell incident had carried his child. Rose would later tell me about how Jack returned from the Big Shell unable to put away his memories as a child soldier. He'd get drunk, and some nights he'd returned covered in injuries. Eventually she had a miscarriage, and he disappeared. When I first learned all of that, I had trouble accepting it. How could that have happened? For a brief moment, I even thought, why couldn't she have come to Snake or me? But I know that neither of us could really have done anything for her. But when her face appeared on the screen inside the cargo bay, I was suddenly reminded of something else I'd heard. I looked at Snake. He seemed to simultaneously come to the same realization, and it wasn't a pleasant one. "Colonel," Snake said, "the woman you married, the one that Merrill was talking about." "It's Rosemary, yes. I didn't tell you before?" Snake and I sighed in unison. "What were you thinking?" Snake asked. "She's young enough to be your daughter." Campbell's response was only more depressing. "Yeah, lucky me, huh?" I nearly laughed at the absurdity. Snake, disgusted, said, "Now I see why Merrill won't have anything to do with you." "Merrill said something about me?" The flippant tone had left the colonel's voice, replaced with a deep pain, but neither Snake nor I were in the mood to feel sorry for him. Snake flatly replied, "Yeah, I believe her words were, 'I'll never forgive that womanizing piece of shit.'" "I see." With none of us having any desire to linger on the aggravating and bizarre revelation, we instead sought refuge in our own various battle preparations. I tested Snake's octo-camo and calibrated the power assist on his sneaking suit. Then I ran the Mark II's system tests and went through Nomad's inspection checklist to prepare for our eventual departure. When the time came for Snake to leave, Sunny stood on the edge of the cargo bay, waved goodbye, and called out, "See you, Snake." Snake returned a smile. He would be gone for at least several days without having to endure her fried eggs. I looked at Sunny, watching Snake reach the edge of the tarmac, and I thought, we're something like a family, aren't we? We weren't really a family, of course, but at that moment I felt at peace. If only everything could have stayed like that. I shook my head. What was I thinking at a time like this? Snake was about to enter another battlefield. Using the ID Campbell had provided, Snake passed through customs and immigration. He climbed in the 4x4 and headed up to the mountainous region on the other side of the border. Just a few years ago, the high altitude wouldn't have been a problem for Snake. But with his aged lungs, Snake was having trouble adjusting to the low oxygen. Fortunately, he'd have time to adjust. The mountains were quite far. But as the elevation increased, Snake only seemed to become worse off. He rarely spoke, and the occasional bead of sweat rolled down his cheek. "Snake," I asked over the codec, "how are you holding up?" Snake was reluctant as ever to discuss his body, simply asked,
"What's our current situation?"
I sighed. Rebel guerrilla units are advancing on the base of the government PMC troops. The building appears to be Liquid's safe house. According to Naomi's data, she's being held prisoner inside the compound. I sent a satellite image of the compound through the solid eye.
"Where is she?"
he asked. Assuming Naomi's data is correct, according to satellite imagery produced by Mei Ling, the facility where Naomi is being held is to the north, along a mountain road. I'm sending the location to your map. Snake hadn't heard the name in a while.
"Mei Ling?"
Yeah. Along with Colonel Campbell, Mei Ling was part of Snake's wireless support team during the Shadow Moses incident. Back then, she was still a teenager, but now 9 years had passed, and she was a grown woman. She'd become the captain of the USS Missouri, a battleship from the time where giant turrets were still the backbone of naval power. Missouri had a long and storied history, including serving as the setting for a Steven Seagal movie. But with the advent of carrier fleets, the expensive and inflexible battleship-class vessels became obsolete. Although cannon power attacks on coastal areas remained in sporadic use through the Gulf War, Missouri was retired as an aged soldier, no longer of use in the modern era, in the following year, 92. The rest of the battleships would meet the same fate by the mid-90s. Now the seas were dominated by frigate-class ships and cruisers powered by the mighty Aegis system. After its decommissioning, Missouri was sent to Hawaii to live out the rest of its years as a tourist attraction. But after its museum contract expired, the ship was recommissioned and used for virtual training. Rather than actual combat training, the goal seemed to be getting the sailors acclimated to seamanship aboard an analog vessel. In short, everyone involved with the Shadow Moses incident had either become fugitives or had been sidelined into non-essential dead-end appointments. The same had happened to Merrill. She was wasting away in some desk job when Campbell pulled some connections in the Army and placed her within the PMC inspection unit, an assignment considered extremely dangerous, even for the CID.
"Otacon,"
Snake said.
"I just saw a PMC armored truck. I think I'm not far from Pierre Armament patrols. I even saw some giant billboard advertisements for them. Arms of the octopus, arms for your war."
That might sound appealing if you're desperate, but in the fog of war, 8 arms aren't enough. Even some nonsense name like Octopus Armaments takes out an elegantly feminine quality when it's said in French. Pierre of Armaments. Personally, I found all this ebullience over the booming war economy distasteful. I confirmed Snake's position data on the GPS, then said, "You better ditch your car. The area is a veritable hornet's nest of PMC patrols." Snake voiced his acknowledgement. He left the 4x4 hidden in a thicket of trees and lowered the Mark II from the back. He adjusted the octo-camo and took slow, even breaths to condition his breathing to the thin atmosphere. He studied his environment and attuned his senses and his intuition to the South American highlands. The smell of the grass, the smell of the bugs, the smell of the earth. Crawling on the ground, the smells were unavoidable, and to Snake, they were an essential component of his senses. When others were, or had recently been nearby, they left ripples in what Snake liked to think as a baseline. The forest and the earth were a delicate system within which Snake could pick out traces of human disturbance. By attuning his senses to the ripples in that baseline, his situational awareness surpassed what most would consider possible. Even with some of his attention dedicated to keeping track of PMC forces, Snake soon reached the path. Nestled in a dell at its mouth was a village with several houses, a barn, and a PMC armored truck. The battlefront had arrived ahead of Snake. Defeated rebel soldiers were gathered together on their knees. A number of battle-scarred corpses were scattered around the village, all of them anti-government forces. The rebels had no uniforms and carried mismatched sets of whatever equipment they were able to scavenge or improvise. The PMC soldiers, of course, wore combat chest harnesses and Pro-Tech helmets, their equipment on par with that of the U.S. Army. Flames spewed from one of the houses. Likely the village had been a rebel hideout. By blurring the line between the battlefield and civilian life, guerrillas could evade the attacks of conventional armies. The guerrilla warfare tactics employed in the mountains of South America owed much to Mao Zedong. A mountainous expanse covered much of China's territory and the farming villages in those highlands. Mao had made his stronghold. He knew the urbanized forces would not be suited to the steep ranges. South America, with a similar share of mountains and villages, had a lot in common with China. At one with the forest, Snake observed the PMCs through his solid eye. A figure emerged from the flaming house. The man was noticeably taller than the PMC soldiers. He wore a long black coat utterly out of place in a battlefield. Snake recognized him. The man was one of the monsters of the rebel unit Dead Cell, whom we thought had been shot to death by Raiden on the big shell. But death never seemed to take for him, as he could be stabbed in the chest or shot through the head and laugh it off. The man's teeth had once been at Snake's throat, and Snake could still remember how his eyes had looked. Bottomless, black, lifeless, like a vampire.
"It's Vamp,"
Snake said, and when I heard those words, time stood still. Vamp. The heartbreak of seeing his knife stick into my sister's stomach had haunted me for years. How much better would it have been if the knife been pointed at me instead? How many times have Emma's last words echoed inside me just as I was about to fall asleep? All I could do every night was grit my teeth and clutch at the bed sheets to endure the memory of her feeble lips forming to the words, "Call me Emma." Reliving that moment reduced me to tears every time. That man, that Nosferatu, killed Emma.
"Otacon! Otacon!"
I snapped back to the mission. Snake must have been calling my name over the codec for some time. I put my hand to my chest and tried to calm my hastening pulse and breathing. No easy task with that man on the other side of the monitor, on the other side of Snake's solid eye. "I'm sorry," I said. "He must be involved with Liquid's plans." Vamp had been working in concert with Ocelot on the big shell.
"It's possible, but I thought Jack took him out in Manhattan."
I bit my lips. Was Vamp really immortal? Maybe I should have felt afraid, or incredulous, at the possibility of facing an enemy who couldn't die. But all I could feel was the rising anger for the man who killed my sister. I tried to fight it back, but my racing heart sent blood straight to my head. My temples started to ache from the intensity of my emotions. "I swear the next time I see him."
"Otacon, get a grip!"
Snake's shouting broke me free from the magnetic draw of my hatred. For the moment, at least, I was thinking straight again. The burning anger had subsided into an icy black river. I said to Snake, "Let's see what the PMC troops are up to." Snake acknowledged and moved to where he could hear their voices, from which we gathered the Pierre of Armament soldiers were searching for Snake's whereabouts. The soldiers reported to Vamp that Snake hadn't been in the village. Vamp's skin was whiter than it had been on the big shell, and veins stood out on his cheek like neural pathways.
"The guerrillas have scattered,"
Vamp said to the men, his voice low and smooth, straight out of a nightmare.
"But they'll be coming to storm the safe house. He must be among their numbers. Sooner or later he will come. Don't let down your guard."
The PMC troops saluted, and Vamp climbed into the armored truck and left the smoldering village behind. Somehow they knew Snake was coming. "This could be a trap," I said.
"Yeah. We'll need to stay sharp."